Earl Whitaker, a retired canine officer with a heart full of ghosts, stood before a starving German shepherd no one dared to touch. "This dog's beyond saving," he growled to the crowd. "If anyone can make him obey, the mutt's yours." But then Luke Carter, a young police officer with calm eyes and a hidden scar, stepped into the ring. 6 minutes later, the wild beast was sitting at his feet, tail gently thumping against the dirt, and Earl froze. Because on the back of Luke's neck was a birthmark, the same one his lost son had when he disappeared 22 years ago. Who was this young man? And could the dog, broken and beaten, be the key to reuniting a father and son separated by time, guilt, and fate? What happens next will break your heart and then mend it again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Let's see how far this story of love, loss, and redemption can travel. The wind came down from the Rockies like a long sigh, dragging dust and the smell of dry pine across the valley. The town of Hollow Creek, Colorado, looked half asleep under a pale winter sun. Trucks parked crooked in front of diners, flags stiff in the cold, and the far-off hum of something that used to feel like hope. At the edge of town stood the Hollow Creek Canine Training Grounds, a place once known for discipline and devotion, now held together by rusted bolts and habit. The fences rattled in the wind, their paint blistered and flaking. Someone had left a sign half fallen near the gate, where the broken learn to trust again. Inside the arena, Earl Whitaker stood alone in the dust. 63 years old, shoulders still broad but curved under the weight of old work. His gray hair was clipped short, his beard rough with frost. The dark blue jacket he wore, stitched with a faded Denver canine emblem, hung too loose now, like a uniform from another lifetime. Once, Earl had been famous. They called him the Dog Whisperer of Denver, a man who could tame anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. But fame doesn't pay the bills, and the years had stripped away what glory couldn't hold. The training center was all he had left, and even that was slipping. Today, he was hosting what he called a fundraiser. The truth was uglier. A public auction of dogs, most of them rescues, some trained, others still fighting ghosts no command could reach. A small crowd had gathered on the bleachers, ranchers, local deputies, families curious about a bargain. The cold pressed color from their cheeks as they shuffled, cups of coffee steaming in gloved hands. A loudspeaker popped and hissed before sputtering to life. Earl's longtime partner, Mac Doyle, adjusted the microphone. Mac was 58, a stocky man with a neck like an oak stump and the posture of someone allergic to small talk. "All right, folks," he called, his voice scraping through the speaker. "We'll start with pens 1 through 6. Trained dogs, good temperament, ready to work." The first few sales went quick. A golden retriever to a retired schoolteacher, a lab mix to a young farmer. Earl nodded approvingly each time, his face unreadable. Then came pen number 7. The crowd went quieter than the wind. Inside the cage, chained to a post, stood a German shepherd so gaunt that his ribs showed like the bones of a broken instrument. His coat was matted, his eyes sharp and yellow, burning with the kind of fury that makes handlers nervous. His tag read Rex, though he hadn't answered to that name in months. "Brought in from a raid down near Pueblo," Mac explained. "Confiscated from a backyard fighting ring. Starved near to death. Bit 3 handlers. Doesn't take food unless no one's watching." The murmuring began. Someone whispered, "Should have been put down." Earl stepped forward. "That one," he said, pointing toward Rex, "was found tied to a steel. Drum, half dead, teeth filed down, still tried to stand when we cut him loose." He paused, eyes fixed on the animal pacing in the pen. "I've worked with dogs 40 years. Seen 'em broken, scared, angry, but never one like this. This one doesn't trust breath itself. You think you've seen a lost cause? He's it. And I'll tell you plain, no man alive can tame him. Not me, not you, not even God." The words hung in the air like frost. Rex stopped pacing, his head tilted slightly, one ear twitching, eyes locked on Earl as if recognizing something, perhaps the echo of another damaged thing. From the back of the bleachers a voice rose, clear, confident. Or maybe he's just waiting for someone to try. The crowd turned. Standing near the fence was a young woman with a small camera and a press badge clipped to her coat. Nora Hayes, 27, reporter for the Denver Gazette. Sharp jawline, quick eyes, hair tied in a careless bun that looked like it belonged in a different, warmer season. She wore city boots unsuited for the mud, but her posture was firm, defiant. Earl squinted. Press? Local feature, she said, stepping closer. Word is, the great Earl Whitaker's turned from rescuer to salesman. Thought I'd see for myself. Mac groaned under his breath. Here we go again. Earl wiped his hands on his jeans. You can write whatever sells papers, Miss Hayes. These dogs don't run on good intentions. Feed, meds, heat, none of it's free. So, this is about money, Nora shot back. This is about survival. Rex growled softly, his body tense like a drawn bow. The crowd stepped back again. Earl turned to them, his voice cutting through the murmurs. You see that look in his eyes? That's what happens when the world teaches an animal to expect pain. You can't fix that with treats or words. You fix it with time, or you don't fix it at all. He reached for the gate latch, then hesitated. Something, anger, maybe pride, hardened in his face. He raised his voice. I'll tell you what, I'll make a wager. 5 minutes. Anyone here who can get this dog to follow a single command, sit, stay, heel, doesn't matter, can have him. $1. No cages, no tricks, no force. The arena went still. Wind rattled the flags. No one spoke. Nora lowered her camera. That's cruel, she said quietly. You're gambling with fear. Earl's eyes met hers. I'm gambling on hope. For a long moment, neither looked away. Behind them, Rex gave a short, sharp bark, once, like a warning or a laugh. Mac cleared his throat. Anyone? 5 minutes? $1. No one moved. The crowd stared at the dog, at the dust, at each other. Even the children who had been giggling earlier sat quiet, sensing something sacred in the stillness. Finally, Earl sighed and shook his head. Didn't think so. He turned to close the pen, but Rex stepped forward, just one paw, slow, deliberate. The chain rattled softly. Their eyes met again. Something unspoken passed between them, brief and fragile as a breath. Earl whispered, mostly to himself, You and me both, boy. Nora kept her camera up, lens trembling slightly in her hands. Through it, she saw 2 broken creatures facing each other across the same line, one caged by fear, the other by regret. The cold wind swept through the arena again, carrying the sound of Earl's final words for the day. If kindness can't reach him, nothing will. The crowd began to disperse, boots crunching over gravel, voices fading into the whistle of the air. Nora lingered by the fence, scribbling notes, the smell of rust and wet fur clinging to her sleeves. Rex lay down in the corner of the pen, his gaze never leaving the old man. Earl stood still, shoulders stiff against the wind, wondering, for the first time in years, if he'd just met the one creature as stubborn as himself. Above them, the sky shifted to silver, heavy with the promise of snow. The arena, cracked and tired, held its breath. Something had begun. The air inside the Hollow Creek Arena was dry and sharp, carrying that metallic taste that comes before snow. The crowd still stood where they had been minutes ago, caught between disbelief and expectation. Earl Whitaker's challenge echoed in their heads. 5 minutes, $1. Anyone who can make him obey, he's yours. Rex prowled inside the pen, tail low, eyes glowing like embers. His breath fogged the air in short, angry bursts. The silence had grown heavy enough to make even the wind hesitate. Earl could feel it pressing on his chest, the quiet weight of pride, of exhaustion, of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Then a voice broke through the murmuring crowd, calm, deep, and certain. I'll take that bet. Heads turned. A man stepped down from the back of the bleachers. Luke Carter, mid-30s, tall and lean, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been trained to measure every motion. He wore a dark navy patrol jacket with a silver badge catching the fading sunlight, faded jeans, and old work boots that had seen more than one winter. His hair was short, his jaw shadowed, and there was a faint, half-healed scar along the left side of his neck, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Earl squinted. You're a cop. Luke nodded once. Denver PD, K-9 Division. The crowd murmured louder. Someone whispered, Guess we've got a real expert now. Earl leaned against the railing. You know this isn't a demo, right? That dog's eaten through 2 handlers in half a week. Luke's answer was calm, his voice steady. I'm not here to prove anything. Just thought maybe he deserves to be spoken to. The crowd laughed nervously. One man muttered, "Spoken to? It's a damn dog, not a priest." Luke ignored them. He removed his gloves, tucked them into his belt, and stepped closer to the pen. His movements were slow, respectful, deliberate, like someone entering a church rather than a cage. Nora Hayes raised her camera instinctively, adjusting the focus. She was a journalist, yes, but this was more than a story. Something in Luke's calmness pulled at her curiosity. She whispered to herself, "Either this is genius or suicide," and pressed record. The metal latch clicked. Rex's head snapped up instantly. His growl came from deep within, low and guttural, the sound of distrust shaped into breath. The dog's chain rattled like warning bells. Luke stepped inside. He didn't bring a leash, didn't hold a stick, didn't even raise his hands. He simply stood still, just a few meters away, eyes meeting the animals. Earl called out, "You've got 5 minutes, officer." Luke didn't respond. He crouched slowly until his knees touched the dirt, letting the cold seep through his jeans. "Hey, boy," he murmured, his tone almost conversational. "Rough world out there, huh?" Rex bared his teeth, pacing, muscles twitching under his thin fur, the dog's. Breathing was erratic, his body trembling from a mix of fear and anger. But Luke stayed perfectly still. His presence seemed to steady the air. He kept talking, softly, rhythmically. "You don't know me, and I don't know you, but I've been where you are too, locked up, waiting for someone to decide what happens next." The crowd shifted uneasily. Earl folded his arms, watching with something between curiosity and disbelief. "He's crazy," Mac muttered beside him. "No," Earl said quietly. "He's listening." 3 minutes passed. Luke didn't move closer. He only breathed deeper, letting Rex match the rhythm. Slowly, impossibly, the growl faded. Luke took a slow step forward, then another. "See this?" he said gently, pressing a hand against his chest. "Still beating. That's all I'm asking from you. Just breathe with me." Rex's ears flicked. The chain stopped rattling. 4 minutes. The dog took a step forward, then another. His tail twitched once, hesitant, unsure. By the 5th minute, the crowd had gone utterly still. Even Nora had stopped adjusting the camera. She was holding her breath. Luke spoke again, this time barely a whisper. "Good boy. That's it." He reached out his hand, open and unthreatening, palm up toward the earth. Rex hesitated for one unbearable second, then lowered his head, sniffed the offered hand, and sat down. The arena exhaled all at once. People gasped, some clapped instinctively, others stood frozen in disbelief. Earl's mouth fell slightly open. His heartbeat thudded somewhere behind his ribs, steady but disoriented. He'd seen obedience before, but not peace, not like this. Luke let the moment linger. He didn't rush it, didn't command the dog further. He simply placed his hand gently against Rex's shoulder. The animal flinched once, then leaned into the touch like a creature remembering what trust felt like. 6 minutes. Nora's camera trembled in her hands as she zoomed in on the shot. The young officer, the broken dog, and the world standing still around them. Her journalist's instinct screamed that this was gold, but another voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was something sacred. The crowd erupted into noise again. Applause, shouts, disbelief. "Unbelievable!" someone yelled. "That's a miracle!" another cried. Earl stepped forward, boots kicking up dust. His voice was rough when he spoke. "How the hell did you do that?" Luke finally looked up, calm but distant. "Didn't do anything," he said simply. "Just stopped fighting him." Mac shook his head, half grinning. "Well, you sure stopped all of us." Nora lowered her camera and exhaled. She whispered to herself, "People need to see this." Earl still hadn't moved. He stared at the man and the dog, his thoughts tangled between pride, awe, and something deeper he couldn't name. He wanted to say something more, but the moment had already passed. Luke rose, to his feet, dusting off his jeans. Rex followed him automatically, tail low but calm. The dog's eyes, once feral, now looked almost gentle. The transformation felt impossible, but it was real, raw, and quiet. The arena burst into applause again as Luke stepped out of the pen. Nora's camera followed his every move. He gave a polite nod toward the crowd, then to Earl. "He's a good dog," Luke said softly. "He just needed someone to see him." Earl swallowed hard. That's not something you can teach. No, Luke replied. It's something you remember. He turned and began walking toward the exit, Rex trotting obediently beside him, Jane dragging behind like a forgotten burden. Nora watched him leave through her lens, her heart still hammering from the power of what she had just witnessed. She whispered under her breath, "This is going to change everything." And it did. By nightfall, the footage she had filmed, 6 minutes of silence, calm, and surrender, was uploaded to her channel with a simple caption, "A dog who trusted again." Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Across the country, people shared it. Veterans, animal lovers, strangers who'd long forgotten what grace looked like. They called it the 6-minute miracle. But in Hollow Creek, as darkness fell over the empty arena, Earl Whitaker stood alone by the fence, watching the echo of that moment fade into the cold. He didn't know yet what the world was about to make of it, or what it would uncover. The cheers were still fading when Luke Carter stepped out of the ring, Rex padding quietly at his side. The crowd followed him with their eyes, stunned, whispering to each other as though afraid to disturb the strange calm that lingered in the air. Earl Whitaker stood by the fence, his pulse thudding in his ears, not from excitement but from something else, something colder and heavier that he couldn't name yet. Luke paused near the exit, brushing dust from his sleeve. The setting sun caught the back of his neck, and that's when Earl saw it. A small, pale mark just below the collar, shaped like a crooked star. It wasn't much, barely visible beneath his short hair, but to Earl it hit like a lightning strike. He froze. His breath hitched. The sound of the arena blurred away until there was only that shape. That faint scar burned into memory. 22 years gone, but it was as clear as if he were holding the boy again. The boy who used to chase their dog through the yard, laughing in the long Denver summers. The boy who had the same mark just there, just under the ear, the boy who never came home after the divorce tore their world in two. Luke reached for the gate, unaware of the storm behind him. Earl's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat closed around the name that almost slipped out, Caleb. He swallowed it, letting it dissolve into silence. The years had taught him that ghosts were best left undisturbed. Mac Doyle appeared beside him, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You okay, boss?" Earl blinked hard, dragging himself back. "Yeah," he muttered, voice hoarse. "Just the crowd. Too much noise." Mac chuckled. "Hell of a show, though. Kid handled that dog like a saint. You think he trained him somewhere before?" "No," Earl said absently, eyes still locked on the retreating figure. "No, that was something else." Nora Hayes, camera still slung over her shoulder, was pacing along the fence, whispering into her phone. "Yes, uploads live," she said quickly. "Title, The 6-Minute Miracle, Denver Officer Tames a Lost K9. Tag, Denver PD, Animal Rescue, Hollow Creek, all of it. No, don't mention Earl Whitaker yet. We'll do that follow-up tomorrow." She ended the call and turned, her eyes sharp and curious. She caught the look on Earl's face and frowned. "Mr. Whitaker, you okay?" Earl straightened, forcing calm into his voice. "Fine. Just tired. Been a long day." "You look like you saw a ghost," she said lightly, half joking. "Maybe I did." Nora smiled, but something in his tone made her pause. She studied him for a second longer than politeness allowed before moving off toward the parking lot. When the last of the cars pulled away and the lights over the arena flickered out one by one, Earl stayed behind. The cold deepened, settling into the bones of the wooden stands and the steel gates. He reached for the railing where Luke had stood, and traced the spot with his hand, almost as if he could still feel the presence there. Behind him, Mac locked the final gate and pocketed the keys. "I'll head out," he said. "See you in the morning?" "Yeah," Earl murmured. "Don't stay too long. Place gets colder than the grave after dark." When Mac's truck rumbled away, silence swallowed the arena. Earl turned toward the empty ring where Rex had stood. The Jane lay coiled in the dirt like a shed skin. He knelt down, his knees popping, and picked it up. For a long moment he just stared at it. The dull steel, the faint trace of fur still caught in the links. He whispered to the night. "Can't be him. He'd be 33 by now. He's gone." But the thought wouldn't leave him. The star-shaped scar, the calm voice, the way the dog had followed him, it all pressed against the edges of reason like a heartbeat against a wound that never healed. He closed the gate and walked toward the office. The building was small, half wood, half concrete, with fading posters of K9 units on the walls. Inside, a single bulb hummed weakly above the desk. On the far shelf sat a picture frame. Dusty, glass cracked. A woman with kind eyes held a small boy on her lap. The boy's hair was dark and messy, and just beneath his left ear, a faint birthmark shaped like a star. Earl sank into the chair, elbows on his knees. He had never remarried, never moved far. The divorce had taken more than his wife. It had taken the right to even look for his son. His ex-wife, Ellen, had left Denver and remarried in another state. The last he heard, the boy had taken her new husband's name. He pressed his palms against his face. "What are the odds?" he muttered. Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made him lift his head. A car door slammed. He frowned and went to the window. Nora Hayes was back. She was standing near the fence, phone pressed to her ear, voice low but tense. "Yeah, I stayed behind," she whispered. "You won't believe what I saw today. That man, Whitaker, something's off about him. The way he looked at the officer, like he'd seen a ghost. And Mac called him boss, even though the center's supposed to be broke. There's more here than a viral clip." A pause. Then, "No, I'm not publishing yet, but I'm going to find out what he's hiding." Earl's stomach dropped. He opened the door. "Miss Hayes?" he called out. She startled, spinning around. "Oh, Mr. Whitaker, I didn't think you were still here." "I could say the same for you," he said evenly. "You planning to camp out, or just eavesdrop on ghosts?" She blushed faintly. "Just following up? I thought I left my microphone." He studied her for a long second. "You're not a bad liar," he said finally. "But you're not a good one either." She exhaled, lowering her phone. "You looked shaken after the demonstration. I thought maybe there was more to it. Maybe you knew the officer." Earl leaned against the post, his shadow stretching long across the gravel. Knew him? No. Just recognized the kind of pain in his eyes. Nora didn't buy it. "You've got a reputation, Mr. Whitaker. People think you're a hero. But I've read the old reports. There were investigations. Something about the Denver raid, the death of a K9 partner, funds gone missing from the training program. And now this?" Earl's jaw tightened. "You dig into enough graves, Miss Hayes. You're bound to wake something that bites." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then I guess I'll bring a flashlight." He almost smiled. Almost. "You remind me of someone who never learned when to stop asking questions." She pocketed her phone. Maybe that's what stories are for, finding what people would rather forget. Earl turned away, hand tightening on the railing. "Sometimes forgetting's the only way to live with what's left." Nora hesitated, then softened her tone. "You really think that?" He didn't answer. She studied him for a moment longer before heading to her car. "I'll see you again, Mr. Whitaker." He didn't turn around. "I don't doubt it." When her headlights disappeared down the road, Earl stood alone again, the cold settling in around him. He looked once more toward the gate where Luke had stood earlier. The memory of that star-shaped mark flickered in his mind, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of applause still lingered, fading into the kind of silence that only comes after something important has been lost or found. The next morning broke gray and soundless over Hollow Creek. Frost glazed the old training yard, and the wind crept through the cracks of Earl Whitaker's office like an unwanted guest. He sat slouched in his chair, the same position he'd fallen asleep in, a cold cup of coffee beside him, and the chain from Rex's pen coiled loosely on the desk like a reminder. The night had been long. The image of that star-shaped scar kept burning behind his eyelids no matter how tightly he shut them. He stared at the photo frame on his desk, the one with the cracked glass. It showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven, wearing his Denver PD uniform. Beside him stood his wife, Ellen Whitaker, a gentle-looking woman with auburn hair tied back and a cautious smile. Between them, a boy of 10 beamed at the camera, clutching a toy police badge. His name was Caleb. Earl ran a thumb over the boy's face, tracing the faint blur where time had eaten away the ink. He whispered, "You'd be about his age now." Then the memories began to crawl back, slow and heavy as smoke. He had once lived in Denver, not far from the station. Back then, he was one of the department's rising names, an expert in K9 operations, known for bravery and precision. His partner at the time was Sergeant Tom Grayson, a man built like a wall, mid-40s, sharp jaw, eyes cold with authority. Grayson had mentored him, pushed him harder than anyone else. "Discipline makes the badge shine," he used to say. Earl had believed it, but the job consumed everything. Days turned into double shifts, nights blurred into patrols. Ellen had begged him to slow down. "Caleb needs his father, not a hero," she'd said once, voice breaking. He'd promised her he'd try, but promises mean little when guilt feels like duty. The day Ellen left was the same day his precinct got the call. A warehouse fire, 2 officers missing. Earl threw himself into the flames without hesitation. He saved one of them. The other didn't make it. And by the time he came home, the house was already gone. Smoke still rising from the ruins, sirens wailing, neighbors staring. He never saw Caleb's body. They told him it was lost in the blaze. That night had hollowed him out. He'd stood in front of the ashes until dawn, the badge heavy on his chest. He told himself that losing everything was penance, but deep down he knew it was punishment. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the memory away. "No ghosts," he muttered. But the past had sharp teeth. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Nora Hayes stepped out of her car, wrapped in a thick brown coat, a folder clutched under one arm. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, her hair tied in a hurried knot. She'd spent the whole night digging through records, chasing the instinct that Earl Whitaker was hiding something much larger than a broken dog. She pushed open the office door without knocking. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her breath clouding the air. "We need to talk." Earl didn't look up. "You ever learn manners, Miss Hayes?" She ignored the jab, laying the folder on his desk. "You told me last night that forgetting is the only way to live with what's left. So tell me, what's left after you lose everything?" He finally met her eyes. "You got 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't throw you off my property." "Because I think your past isn't what you believe it is." That stopped him. She opened the folder. Inside were copies of old police reports. Yellowed, stamped, half-burned. "I went to the Denver archives," she explained. "You were assigned to the Grayson unit in '03, correct? The same division that handled the warehouse arson investigation, the one that happened the same week your family home burned down." Earl stiffened. "You've been digging where you don't belong." Nora's tone softened, almost apologetic. "The warehouse fire wasn't an accident. The report was altered. The blaze was traced to stolen evidence, a cache of narcotics being smuggled out by one of your own. The department buried it to protect a senior officer, Sergeant Tom Grayson." He froze. Her words landed like cold water. She continued, voice trembling slightly. "You were listed as a key witness but then reassigned before the hearings. The trail ends there, except your house burned down 2 days later. Official cause, electrical fault. But the fire chief's notes mention chemical accelerant. That's not faulty wiring, Mr. Whitaker. That's a cover-up." Earl pushed away from the desk, pacing. "Stop." Nora kept going. "You lost your son and your wife that week, didn't you? Maybe it wasn't fate. Maybe someone wanted to keep you quiet." He turned sharply, eyes blazing. "You don't know what you're talking about." She didn't flinch. "Then tell me I'm wrong." The silence that followed was long enough for the ticking clock to sound like thunder. Finally, Earl spoke, voice low and broken. "Grayson was a bastard. Everyone knew he had his hands in dirty deals, but no one had proof. I filed a report, but it disappeared. A week later, my world did too." Nora closed the folder. "You never told anyone." "No one would have listened. The department protects its own." He sank back into the chair, rubbing his face. "I spent years convincing myself it was an accident because that was easier than thinking someone did it on purpose." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "And what about your son?" Earl's voice cracked. "They said he didn't make it, but there were no remains, just a toy badge found in the debris." Nora's journalistic instincts told her to ask more, but something in his expression made her stop. The grief wasn't performative. It was raw, like a wound that still bled when touched. She took a step back. "There's one more thing you should see." From the folder, she slid out a printed document, a transfer record from the Denver Police Department. Grayson's name appears again, 20 years later. He's still active, now in an administrative role overseeing canine operations. And you know who's in his division? Earl stared blankly. She turned the page toward him. At the bottom, highlighted in black ink, was a name. Officer Luke Carter, K-9 Unit. Earl's breath caught. The room tilted slightly. Nora didn't notice. She was already talking, excitement flickering in her voice. "If what I'm thinking is right, Luke Carter may not just be some random officer who showed up here by chance. He's working under the same man who destroyed your life." He looked away, voice barely a whisper. "Or maybe he's the piece of it I lost." "What did you say?" "Nothing," he said quickly. Nora narrowed her eyes but didn't push further. "I'm going back to Denver," she said. "There's something bigger here. If Grayson buried the truth once, maybe he's still doing it." Earl stared out the window at the empty yard where the snow was beginning to fall. "You're chasing a ghost, Miss Hayes. Careful, it might chase you back." She gave a faint smile. Ghosts make the best stories. As she left, Earl looked again at the photograph on his desk. The edges had curled with age, the faces faded. He traced the outline of the boy's smile, whispering, "If you're out there, Caleb, what did they turn you into?" The wind pushed against the window pane, carrying with it the faint sound of sirens from somewhere far down the highway, like echoes from another life, another badge, another fire. He sat alone in the cold, the silence pressing down like smoke, the ghosts of the badge gathering around him once more. The Hollow Creek Training Center hadn't been that loud in years. Trucks and news vans lined the narrow dirt road leading up to the old gate. Camera crews were setting up near the sign that used to read, "Where the Broken Learn to Trust Again," though now the paint looked newer, freshly brushed over by someone trying to make the place look less forgotten. Earl Whitaker stood by the fence, watching the commotion with the uneasy expression of a man whose life had been quiet for far too long. The video Nora Hayes uploaded 2 nights before had exploded across the internet. Over 6 million views, comments in every language. A miracle of patience. Proof that trauma can heal. That old trainer should be ashamed for giving up. The world had found its new argument and its new villain. Nora herself had barely slept since. She had become the story's accidental narrator. The Denver Chronicle had published her article, 6 Minutes That Changed a Dog's Fate. She'd written it honestly, about redemption, empathy, and second chances, but she hadn't expected what came after. Half the country wanted to turn the old canine center into a monument of hope. The other half dug through old police records, dragging Earl's past into the open again. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Hero of Hollow, Creek, #Dog Whisperer or Fraud, La Justice for Rex. Earl kept his phone off, but the calls kept coming anyway. Reporters, activists, even people claiming to be from animal welfare organizations. He'd ignored them all, except one. Luke Carter. Luke had come back the day after the video went viral. He'd arrived at dawn, wearing a faded blue uniform jacket and jeans, carrying nothing but a duffel bag. He'd asked to stay for a few days, to help with Rex's recovery. Earl hadn't said yes immediately, but the truth was he didn't have the heart to say no. Now the 2 men worked mostly in silence. Luke spent hours in the yard with Rex, teaching him to respond to small hand gestures. No commands, no leash. The dog followed him everywhere, calm and obedient. A different creature from the snarling beast of the auction ring. But when Earl tried to approach, Rex's ears went flat and a low growl would rumble in his throat. Earl had seen that kind of mistrust before. What unsettled him wasn't the growl, it was how familiar it felt. He leaned against the fence, watching as Luke knelt beside the dog, holding out a piece of chicken. Rex took it gently from his hand. Luke smiled faintly, the kind of quiet smile that came from small victories. "You feed him better than I feed myself," Earl muttered. Luke looked up. "He listens better than most people." Earl smirked, but didn't reply. Behind them, Nora's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, wearing a dark gray coat, her camera bag slung across her shoulder. She waved lightly. "Good morning, gentlemen. I come in peace?" Earl sighed. "You come with a camera, same thing." She grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." Luke gave her a polite nod. "You here for another interview?" "Actually, no," she said. "I'm here to show you what's happening online." She handed her phone to Earl. The screen glowed with endless notifications, comments, reposts, video reactions. At the top was a headline from Denver Live, "Hero Trainer or Animal Abuser? The Truth Behind Hollow Creek's Dog Whisperer." Earl's face hardened. "Abuser?" Nora shifted uneasily. "They found some old reports, stuff from your Denver days. The raid, the missing funds. People are connecting dots that might not even exist." Luke frowned. "That's not right. The story should be about the dog." "I tried," Nora said quietly, "but the internet decides what it wants. Half the people out there think you're saints. The other half think Rex was some tortured experiment you were trying to auction off." Earl handed back the phone. That's what happens when folks need something to scream about. Truth don't fit in headlines. Rex barked once sharply, as if to punctuate the moment. Luke placed a calming hand on his neck. "It'll pass," he said. "It always does." But Nora wasn't so sure. She had seen how fast things turned. A week ago, she'd written an article about a miracle. Now, she was sitting in the middle of a story about scandal. She sat on the rail beside Earl. "You could fix it, you know," she said. "Do an interview. Tell people your side." "I told the truth once," Earl said dryly. "Cost me everything." Luke looked at him curiously, but didn't ask. He had learned by now that some silences were meant to stay unbroken. Still, there was something about the way Earl carried himself, the weary posture, the way his eyes lingered on the dog and occasionally on Luke, that made the air between them feel charged with unspoken questions. That evening, after Nora left, Luke stayed out in the yard longer than usual. The sunset turned the dirt gold. Rex lay at his feet, content, tail flicking lazily. Earl came out with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one over. "Thanks," Luke said, taking it carefully. They stood there in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustle through the empty kennels. "Why'd you come back?" Earl finally asked. Luke shrugged. "Didn't feel right leaving him." "The dog?" Luke smiled faintly. "Both, I guess." Earl's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You talk too much for a quiet man." "Comes with the badge." That made Earl glance at him. "You ever think about quitting?" "Every day," Luke admitted. "But every day, I remember someone has to stay for the ones who can't." The words hung there between them. Inside the office, Nora's story continued to spread. By midnight, local TV channels were replaying the footage of Rex bowing to Luke in the pen. News anchors debated what it meant. Commentators argued over Earl's past. Animal rights groups began posting petitions, some demanding his recognition, others demanding his arrest. Hashtag Hero of Hollow Creek trended beside hashtag Justice for Rex. Meanwhile, the real Hollow Creek was quiet except for the soft crunch of snow and the low hum of the heater in the kennel. Earl sat in his office again that night, laptop open but untouched. A flood of emails blinked on screen. Invitations, requests, demands. He closed it. Then he looked out the window and saw Luke sitting with Rex in the moonlight, hand resting on the dog's shoulder like they'd known each other forever. Earl's chest tightened. Something old and painful moved there. A feeling halfway between pride and fear. Maybe it was because he saw himself in Luke. Or maybe deep down because he saw someone else entirely. He rubbed a hand over his face. 6 minutes, he murmured. That's all it took to change everything. Outside, Rex lifted his head, ears twitching toward the voice that had once terrified him. Then, after a long moment, he settled back beside Luke again. Calm, faithful, and unafraid. The storm online might have been loud, but in Hollow Creek, the night was still. The snow along Highway 36 had already turned to gray slush by the time Luke Carter's cruiser reached Denver. The city skyline looked colder than he remembered, steel and glass piercing through a pale, cloud-thick morning. He parked in front of the precinct, wiped his badge against his jacket sleeve, and took a deep breath before walking inside. The Denver Police Department headquarters hadn't changed much. Same coffee-stained walls, same echoing halls, same bulletin boards filled with wanted posters no one looked at twice. Yet, for Luke, the air felt heavier. Maybe it was because he'd left something behind at Hollow Creek that still pulled at him, something with sharp eyes, a scarred past, and an old man who carried ghosts in his silence. In the briefing room, a group of officers was already gathered. At the front stood Captain Tom Grayson, a broad man in his early 60s, gray hair trimmed neatly, posture ramrod straight. His reputation was legend in Denver PD, decisive, respected, feared. His crisp uniform looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, his tie pinned with a gold bar that gleamed beneath the fluorescent light. Grayson's voice cut through the room. "We've got an ongoing issue. Black market trade of retired and stolen K9s. Some are sold to private security groups, others to fight rings." He tapped a folder on the podium. "Last week, we intercepted a shipment outside Pueblo. The dogs had training chips traced to a registry that should have been deactivated 20 years ago." Luke frowned. 20 years? Grayson nodded. "The codes match those from the old Hollow Creek Training Center." The words hit like a punch. Luke hid his reaction, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Grayson continued, scanning the room. I'm assigning Officer Carter as lead on this. You've got experience with canines and local connections. Find out who's running the sales and how the hell those chips resurfaced. Luke straightened. Understood, sir. Good. You leave tomorrow. I want a full report by end of week. When the meeting ended, Grayson called him back. Carter. Luke stopped by the doorway. Sir? The older man studied him with a sharp, unreadable gaze. You've been in the news lately. That dog video. Good press for the department, if handled right. I didn't plan it, Luke said quietly. Grayson smirked. Heroes rarely do. Just remember who signs your paycheck. Luke nodded, but something about the man's tone left him uneasy. As he turned to leave, Grayson added, And Carter, Hollow Creek's a graveyard for people who couldn't follow rules. Don't dig too deep. We've already buried enough. The words lingered long after Luke had gone. That evening, he met Nora Hayes in a small diner off Colfax Avenue. She wore a heavy wool coat, dark circles under her eyes, and that same stubborn energy that seemed immune to exhaustion. She'd been waiting for him with her laptop open, a chatouhud. Dozen tabs filled with records, news articles, and scanned files. You're late, she said, not looking up. Captain Grayson kept me, Luke replied, sliding into the booth. Nora's eyebrows rose. Grayson? As in Tom Grayson? Luke nodded. He's leading the case. Apparently, some of the stolen K9 chips came from Hollow Creek's archives. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. Wait, Hollow Creek was under the Denver PD's K9 division before Earl bought it out, right? Luke hesitated. That's what I read. Nora leaned forward, lowering her voice. What if the trafficking ring's not new? What if it's a continuation of whatever happened 20 years ago, the same time Earl's house burned down? He frowned. You're reaching. Maybe, she said. But remember that report I found? The one mentioning Grayson's name in the warehouse fire? Luke exhaled. You think he's involved? I think he's hiding something. The waitress came by, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an apron dusted in flour. She poured them both coffee without asking. Luke thanked her and stared into the cup for a long moment before saying, You know, he warned me not to dig. Nora smirked. Then we're definitely digging. Over the next 3 days, they worked quietly. Nora called in favors with reporters and archivists, tracing financial transactions, adoption papers, and supply invoices. Luke contacted old canine handlers still on the force, asking about chip numbers and missing registries. The deeper they looked, the stranger it got. Several of the old Hollow Creek dogs, officially listed as retired, had actually been reclassified under new ID numbers and shipped to private contractors overseas. The transactions were approved with electronic signatures from inactive personnel. One of those signatures belonged to Earl Whitaker, dated years after his retirement. Luke stared at the document. He couldn't have signed this. He was out of the department by then. Nora leaned closer. Someone forged it to keep the chain of custody clean. That means whoever's behind this needed his name for legitimacy. Luke sat back. And Grayson was his superior. Exactly. The silence between them thickened. Nora's phone buzzed, a message from a contact at the city archives. She read it, her brow furrowing. What is it? Luke asked. The birth record system went through a purge around the same time as the fire, she said slowly. Most files from that district were lost, but a few backups survived in a state database. She began typing quickly, fingers trembling slightly. There's a file here tagged with Grayson's approval code. Luke frowned. What's that got to do with anything? Nora didn't answer at first. Her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief as she scrolled. Oh my God. What? She turned the screen toward him. It displayed a digitized birth certificate, partially burned, incomplete but legible enough. The child's name had been redacted, but the parents' names were clear. Mother, Ellen Whitaker. Father, Earl Whitaker. Luke felt something inside him go still. Nora's voice softened. Luke, the hospital where you were born is the same one that burned down during that fire. He didn't move. The diner noise faded around him, just the sound of the old clock ticking above the counter. That can't be right. It matches your birth date, Nora whispered. Same year, same district. The record says the file was marked as duplicate and reassigned under a different last name, Carter. Luke's grip on the table tightened. My adoption was sealed. My mother never talked about it. She probably couldn't, Nora said gently. If Grayson was involved in covering up the fire, he could have buried everything, including you. Luke stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. No, this is speculation. Nora reached for his arm. I know, but what if it's true? What if that's why Earl looked at you the way he did? He pulled away, voice shaking. I'm not ready for that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Luke muttered, I'll go back to Hollow Creek. I'll ask him myself. Nora nodded, closing her laptop. Be careful. If Grayson finds out we're connecting him to the fire, he won't let it go. Luke glanced toward the window where snow began to fall again. Slow, silent, relentless. Let him try, he said. This time, I'm not walking away. As they left the diner, the neon sign flickered overhead, casting red light across their faces like a warning neither of them could yet name. Somewhere, in the cold heart of the city, Captain Tom Grayson was already on the phone, his voice calm but sharp. Keep an eye on Carter, he said, and if he steps near Hollow Creek again, make sure he doesn't come back with answers. The storm rolled in from the Rockies like an ancient beast, its growl rumbling across the plains long before the first lightning tore through the night. By midnight, the Hollow Creek Training Center was drowning under sheets of rain. The wind howled through the rusted kennels, bending the trees until they screamed. Inside the office, Earl Whitaker sat by the dim glow of a desk lamp, the flicker of the light throwing his face into half-shadow. His right arm was bandaged from an earlier accident, and his breath came slow, heavy. He'd stayed awake for hours, waiting for Luke to return from Denver. Something in his gut told him trouble was coming. He just didn't know from which direction. Rex was restless in the main kennel. The German shepherd paced, whining low, ears twitching at every distant sound. He'd been uneasy since sunset, when the sky turned the color of bruised copper and the air grew too still to trust. Earl rose and went to check on him. Easy, boy, he murmured, running a hand along the chain link. Storm's just showing off. Rex's gaze darted past him toward the tree line, pupils wide. A growl started deep in his throat. Then Earl saw it too. Two faint beams of light cutting through the darkness, headlights moving slowly across the back road that led to the storage shed. Nobody used that road anymore. Not at this hour, not in this weather. He reached for the shotgun hanging by the door. Outside, the rain hit like gravel. The wind nearly tore the cap off his head as he stepped onto the mud-soaked ground. Through the storm, he could make out 3 figures climbing out of a black pickup truck. They wore masks and dark coats, moving fast, flashlights slicing through the downpour. Hey! Earl shouted. The figures froze. Then, one of them lifted a crowbar and smashed the lock off the kennel door. Earl fired into the air. The sound cracked through the night. Back off! They didn't. One raised a pistol. The muzzle flashed once, bright as lightning. The bullet grazed Earl's shoulder, spinning him halfway around. He fell hard, the mud swallowing his knees. Pain flared through his arm, but instinct kept him moving. He fired again, missing on purpose, just to scare them back. Rex erupted from his cage, teeth bared, leaping toward the nearest intruder. The man screamed as the dog's jaws clamped onto his arm. Another swung a bat, striking Rex's ribs, but the shepherd didn't let go. Earl staggered to his feet. Rex, down! Before the dog could obey, the second intruder raised his gun. The sound of sirens sliced through the storm. Red and blue lights blurred across the rain-soaked yard. A police convoy roared down the drive, tires splashing through the mud. At the front was Luke Carter, soaked to the bone, his uniform jacket unbuttoned, eyes sharp as glass. He had driven straight from Denver after intercepting Grayson's coded message about a containment sweep at Hollow Creek. The wording was too neat, too rehearsed. He'd known it meant something bad. He jumped out of the cruiser before it stopped moving. "Earl!" he yelled. One of the intruders turned and fired toward the approaching headlights. Luke ducked, rolling behind the truck, then returned fire. 2 clean shots that shattered the gunman's wrist and sent the weapon flying. The man fell, screaming. The others bolted toward the woods, but the storm swallowed them quickly. Luke sprinted to Earl's side, blood mixed with rain on the old man's shoulder. "Hold still," Luke said, pressing down on the wound. Earl grunted. "Damn cowards. They were after the dogs." Behind them, Rex whimpered, limping toward the fence. His side was bleeding where the bat had struck him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, waiting for the next threat. Luke turned to him. "Easy, buddy. You're okay." But before either man could move, a sharp crack of thunder echoed, and then another gunshot from the woods. The last intruder hadn't run. Luke spun toward the sound, drawing his weapon, but the bullet had already left the barrel. It streaked through the rain, heading straight for Earl. And in one impossible instant, Rex moved. The shepherd lunged, shoving Earl aside. The bullet struck his flank. He yelped, collapsing into the mud. "No!" Earl shouted, crawling toward him. His hands trembled as he cradled the dog's head. Blood soaked through his fingers, warm and slick. Luke's gun fired once more, and the final gunman fell silent somewhere in the trees. The only sounds left were the storm and Rex's shallow breathing. Earl pulled the dog closer, the world around him shrinking into rain and lightning. "Stay with me, boy. You did good. You hear? You did good." Rex's tail moved once, barely. His gaze found Earl's, full of pain but calm, almost proud. Luke dropped to his knees beside them. "Let me help," he said, reaching for his field kit. But when Earl looked up at him, really looked, in the strobing flash of lightning, he froze. The collar of Luke's soaked shirt had slipped aside, revealing that small, star-shaped mark just below his ear. For the first time, it wasn't shadowed or imagined. It was there, undeniable. Earl's lips parted. His voice broke through the storm like a prayer he hadn't dared say in decades. "Ben?" Luke blinked, confused. "What?" "Ben." Earl's voice trembled. "Benjamin Whitaker." Luke went still. The rain pounded harder. He stared at Earl, searching for reason, but all he found was that desperate, tear-streaked face of a man who'd lost too much and was suddenly looking at a miracle he couldn't believe. "That was my boy's name," Earl whispered. "My son. You—" Luke shook his head, backing away as if struck. No, that's not possible." "Your neck," Earl said, pointing weakly. "The mark. The same. Rex whimpered softly, his paw twitching. Earl turned back to him, but Luke couldn't move. His mind spun, colliding memory against memory, the sealed adoption files, the missing records, the way Earl had looked at him that first day. "Ben?" Earl said again, barely audible. Luke took one step back, eyes wide, chest heaving. "My name's Luke," he said, voice shaking. "Luke Carter." The thunder drowned out whatever came next. Rex's breathing slowed. The dog's eyes fluttered once, then went still. Earl bowed his head, pressing his forehead against the shepherd's fur. The tears mixed with rain, indistinguishable. Luke stood frozen in the lightning's flash, half man, half shadow, the storm screaming around him. He didn't know if the ache in his chest was grief or something older, something waiting to be named. The sirens in the distance grew louder as backup arrived, but to the three souls in that yard, one living, one dying, one caught between past and present, the world had already gone silent. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. Colorado's sky remained the color of steel, and the Hollow Creek Training Center stood half-flooded, mud swallowing its fences like the earth itself wanted to erase the memory of that night. Rex's grave lay beneath the tallest pine near the entrance, marked with a small, hand-carved wooden cross. At Denver Mercy Hospital, Earl Whitaker lay in a bed by the window, his shoulder wrapped tightly in gauze, an IV line running into his arm. The man who had once faced burning houses and armed suspects now looked frail under white sheets. His gray hair was unkempt, his face hollow, but his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, still carried the stubborn spark that refused to die. Luke Carter stood by the doorway, his uniform replaced by a plain brown jacket and jeans. His right hand was bandaged where a shard of glass had cut through his palm during the fight. He hesitated before stepping inside. Earl turned his head slightly. "You came," he said, voice rough. "I owed you that much," Luke replied. "Sit, then. Doctor says I'm not dying, though she sounded disappointed when she said it." Luke gave a faint, uncertain smile and pulled up a chair. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, crowded with everything neither of them had yet said. Finally, Luke spoke. "What did you mean, that night, when you called me Ben?" Earl's gaze drifted toward the rain-specked window. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he took a long, shaking breath. "Because that was my son's name, Benjamin Whitaker. He was 6 years old when he disappeared, when I thought he'd died." Luke's voice dropped. "You thought?" Earl nodded slowly. "After Ellen left, she took Ben and went to stay with her sister in Denver. I didn't stop her. I thought maybe they'd be safer away from me. I was deep in the K-9 division back then. Dangerous work, too many enemies, too much pride. He paused. The house fire happened 3 months later. They told me both were gone. I buried empty coffins. Luke's throat tightened. But you never checked? I did. For years, Earl whispered. Private investigators, DNA tests, every dead-end lead you can name. Eventually, the grief turned into guilt, and guilt turned into silence. I figured I'd lost the right to look anymore. The monitor beside the bed beeped softly. Rain ticked against the window. Luke swallowed hard. I grew up in a foster home in Pueblo. The paperwork said my parents died in a fire. I took my foster father's last name, Carter. He wasn't cruel, just distant. When I turned 18, I left. The academy gave me purpose. Earl let out a shaky breath. And they gave you a badge. Luke met his eyes. Maybe that's the one thing we both understood. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two men, bound by blood and years of silence, each recognizing something familiar in the other's face. Then, Earl's voice broke the stillness. You didn't have to come back that night. You could have stayed in Denver, but you did. Why? Luke hesitated. Because Rex trusted you, and I trusted Rex. The old man's eyes glistened. He was smarter than both of us. They both chuckled softly, but the sound faded into quiet. The truth hung there, raw and undeniable. When Nora Hayes entered the room, the energy shifted slightly. She wore a beige trench coat, hair pulled back neatly despite the humidity. Her camera bag hung from one shoulder, and in her hands was a folded newspaper. Am I interrupting? She asked. Earl smiled faintly. You're a reporter. Interrupting is your profession. She stepped closer, setting the paper on his lap. The headline read, The Man Who Lost Two Families and Found His Redemption. Below it was a photo of Earl holding Rex's collar, taken the morning after the storm. Luke looked at Nora, then at the article. You wrote this? She nodded. I thought it was time someone told the truth. You weren't the monster they made you out to be. You were just lost, like everyone else. Earl read silently for a moment, his hand trembling slightly on the page. You wrote kind, he said finally. I wrote honest, Nora replied. You didn't just lose your family once, you lost it twice, through the fire and then through the years you spent hiding from it. But you kept trying to save others, even when you couldn't save yourself. That's not villainy, Mr. Whitaker. That's humanity. Luke exhaled. It's trending, isn't it? Nora gave a small smile. Hashtag Man Who Lost Two Families, 500,000 shares. For once, people aren't angry. They're grateful. Donations are pouring in to rebuild Hollow Creek. There's even talk of renaming the K-9 unit's rescue program after Rex. Earl's voice cracked. He deserves that. The nurse, a gentlewoman in her 50s with kind eyes and a soft southern drawl, entered briefly to check Earl's IV. You keep this up, she said, and we'll have you walking before the weekend. Walking? Earl grinned faintly. I'm thinking about dancing. When she left, the room fell quiet again. Nora perched on the windowsill, watching the rain streak down the glass. Funny thing, she said. The more I wrote about redemption, the more I realized it's never about being forgiven. It's about forgiving yourself. Earl nodded. That's the hard part. Luke rose, standing by the bed. You think we can start over? Earl looked up, eyes soft but uncertain. You mean as father and son? Luke hesitated. Maybe just as two men who finally stopped running from ghosts? Earl extended his hand. Luke took it. The handshake was firm but trembling, half reconciliation, half recognition. Nora smiled quietly, snapping a single photo, not for the paper, but for herself. Outside, the rain eased into a drizzle. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered like the echo of thunder far off in the hills. Earl looked toward the window again. When I get out of here, he said, I'm fixing that roof, and we're getting new pups, ones that still believe in people. Luke chuckled. You sure about that? Place might turn into a zoo. That's fine, Earl said, as long as it's full of life. Nora folded her notebook, slipping it into her bag. Then I guess Hollow Creek's getting a second chance, just like its keeper. As she turned to leave, Luke called after her. Nora. She glanced back. Yeah? Thanks for not giving up on either of us. She smiled. Wasn't my story to give up on. The door closed softly behind her. For a long while, father and son sat in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. There were too many words still unspoken, too many years to fill, but for the first time, neither of them felt the need to rush. The storm outside had done its damage. Now, finally, came the calm. Morning crept gently over Hollow Creek for the first time in weeks. The storm had left the world battered and bruised, but the air now carried the scent of pine and wet earth, the kind that whispers of rebirth. The hills shimmered under dew, the fences glistened with light, and somewhere beyond the woods a hawk called out over a land that felt alive again. Inside the small barn turned clinic, a single heart monitor beeped softly. On the cot, wrapped in a faded plaid blanket, Rex slept. His breathing was shallow but steady. One flank was stitched, the fur shaved clean where the bullet had passed through. His tail twitched every now and then. A dream, or maybe a memory. Luke Carter sat beside him, still in his denim jacket, hair damp with the morning mist. He hadn't left the dog's side in 3 days. Every time Rex stirred, Luke's hand moved to his shoulder, calming him with a steady touch. When the veterinarian, Dr. Miriam Keller, entered, Luke straightened. She was a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and warm-voiced, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, stethoscope swinging at her neck. A former Army medic turned animal doctor, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from saving lives on both 2 legs and 4. "How's our soldier doing?" she asked. Luke smiled faintly. "He's tougher than he looks." "Always are," she said, listening to Rex's chest. After a moment she nodded. "He'll make it, but—" Luke looked up. "But what?" "He's not fit for service anymore. The trauma, the muscle damage. He'll live a long life, but not as a working dog." Luke exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling in one breath. "Then he won't work. He'll stay with me." Dr. Keller smiled softly. "He's lucky to have you." Luke ran a hand over Rex's head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm the lucky one." Outside, the sound of hammering echoed across the yard. Earl Whitaker, arms still bandaged, was standing on a ladder, nailing up a new wooden sign. The old one, cracked and faded, had been taken down after the storm. This new one read, "Hollow Creek Recovery Center for Veterans and Their Companions." The letters were hand-painted by Earl himself. Beside him, 2 younger volunteers, a pair of former Marines, both in their 30s, worked on fixing the roof. They had driven all the way from Denver after reading Nora's article. "Don't you boys ever rest?" Earl called out, voice gruff but full of warmth. One of them, a tall redhead named Mason Briggs, laughed. "Sir, after what you did, the least we can do is fix a few shingles." The other, Diego Morales, a broad-shouldered man with an easy grin, nodded. "Heard you're turning this place into a therapy center. Count us in." Earl grinned under his hat. "Guess I better start buying more coffee." Nora Hayes arrived then, camera slung across her shoulder, her coat fluttering in the breeze. She waved toward Earl before heading toward the barn. Her boots left wet prints on the muddy path. Luke heard her before he saw her. "You know," she said softly, leaning on the doorframe, "you look terrible for a national hero." He smiled without looking up. "Heroes sleep. I don't. Then maybe I brought a cure." She held up 2 cups of coffee. He took one, their fingers brushing briefly. It was a small, almost accidental touch, but it lingered, the kind that carried unspoken weight. "How's he doing?" she asked, nodding toward Rex. "Alive," Luke said, "but he's done working. Doc says no more missions." Nora smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe it's time he stopped fighting." They stood together for a while, watching Rex breathe. Then Nora said, "You know, you 2 aren't so different." Luke chuckled. "I don't bark." "Maybe not," she said, "but you both bite when cornered." He laughed quietly, the sound easing something in the air between them. Outside, the faint wail of a police siren cut through the morning calm. A black SUV pulled up by the front gate, splashing mud as it stopped. 2 federal agents stepped out, dark suits, raincoats, grim expressions. Earl climbed down from the ladder, his jaw tightening. The taller agent, Special Agent Harris, about 50, with tired eyes and a mustache that didn't quite fit his face, approached. "Mr. Whitaker?" "That's me." "I'm here regarding Captain Tom Grayson." Earl's grip on the ladder tightened. "What about him?" "He's in custody. Evidence linked him to the illegal canine trafficking network and the warehouse fire in '03. We also recovered falsified reports tied to your family's case." Earl blinked, his expression unreadable. And the men who hit my place? Harris nodded. Grayson ordered it. He wanted the last of the microchipped dogs destroyed before the investigation caught up. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the ladder and the wind brushing through the pine trees. Justice took its sweet time, Earl said finally. Harris gave a small nod. Sometimes it needs a push. He handed over a folder. You'll want to see this. Official closure of the case file. You're cleared of all previous allegations. Earl looked down at the paper. For 22 years, the weight of those lies had sat on his shoulders. Now, for the first time, it felt like he could stand upright again. Thank you, he said quietly. As the agents drove away, Earl looked toward the barn where Luke and Nora stood together, and something deep inside him shifted. A quiet peace that had been waiting a lifetime. Later that afternoon, Rex was strong enough to stand. He hobbled out into the sunlight, one paw still bandaged, ears perked toward the sky. Luke followed close behind, letting the dog lean against his leg. Earl stood by the gate, watching them approach. Well, look who decided to wake up. Rex wagged. His tail slowly, then sat by Earl's boots. For a moment, the three just stood there, framed by the golden light of the setting sun. Place feels different, Luke said softly. Earl nodded. That's the idea. Thought I'd make something better out of the wreckage. You did, Nora said from behind them, camera in hand. This place feels like it remembers hope. Earl smiled. Maybe it finally learned what it means. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Rex lifted his head toward the horizon. His eyes, once wild and haunted, now shone with calm warmth, as if the light itself belonged to him. Luke knelt, resting a hand on his neck. You're home, he whispered. Earl turned toward Nora, who was quietly wiping a tear she hadn't meant to shed. You gonna write about this too? He asked. She smiled. No, she said. Some stories aren't meant for print. Some just need to live. Luke glanced at her, and for the first time she didn't look away. Their shared silence said more than words ever could. The wind carried the smell of pine and wet earth again. The land that had once been filled with ghosts now felt alive, washed clean by rain and redemption. The next morning, when the first light crept over Hollow Creek, Earl stood on the porch with a mug of coffee. Luke and Nora were walking Rex by the field, their laughter echoing faintly. He smiled to himself, whispering to the sunrise, Second chances. Sometimes they come with fur and 4 legs. Rex barked once, as if in agreement. And, for the first time in decades, Hollow Creek truly had a sunrise worth keeping. The air of late winter carried a clean, quiet kind of chill, the kind that didn't bite, only reminded you that spring was near. A year had passed since the storm, since the night Hollow Creek almost vanished under wind and fire. Now, the rebuilt training yard stood proud under the pale Colorado sun. The fences gleamed silver, the barns freshly painted white, and the new wooden sign above the gate read, Hollow Creek Recovery Center, where trust begins again. Earl Whitaker stood beside that sign, his old sheriff's jacket replaced by a plain brown coat lined with fleece. His face was weathered, but there was something new in it, a softness that had once been buried under years of bitterness. He was no longer the man who lost everything. He had found his son, his purpose, and a peace that still surprised him some mornings. The place was alive again. Veterans moved between kennels, some missing a limb, others carrying invisible wounds that ran deeper. Laughter mixed with the barking of dogs. These men and women came from across the country, people who'd once worn uniforms and lost a part of themselves somewhere between duty and memory. Near the far fence, Luke Carter, or rather Luke Whitaker now, stood in his training gear, whistle hanging around his neck. He wore a fitted navy jacket, jeans dusted with straw, and boots that had seen better days. Rex was beside him, tail wagging, a faint scar still tracing his side but his energy unmistakable. All right, partner, Luke said softly. Let's show them how it's done. Rex barked once, ready. The first group of trainees gathered, 5 men and 2 women, each paired with a rescue dog. Among them was Corporal Dan Ruiz, a 35-year-old Marine veteran with a prosthetic leg and a stubborn grin, and Hannah Reed, a quiet former paramedic in her late 20s, whose Labrador refused to follow any command that wasn't spoken gently. Luke gestured for everyone to watch. It's not about control, he said. It's about trust. You can't fix what's broken by shouting at it. You fix it by standing beside it, and waiting until it decides to trust you back. He crouched, patted his leg, and gave a short, calm command. Rex ran through the obstacle course with practiced grace, weaving between barrels, leaping through a ring, sliding into a perfect sit. The group applauded, and even Earl, leaning against the fence, clapped once, smiling faintly. When the session ended, Luke walked over. "How'd we do, old man?" Earl handed him a towel. "Dog was better than the handler." "Dog always is," Luke said, grinning. They stood together, watching the veterans and their dogs scatter across the yard, helping one another, laughing. Earl's voice softened. "You ever think we'd see this again?" Luke shook his head. "Not like this." "Yeah," Earl said. "Me neither." From behind them, Nora Hayes approached, bundled in a thick gray coat, her hair pulled back and notebook in hand. She wasn't carrying a camera this time. She no longer needed one. "Well," she said cheerfully, "it's been a year and the world still wants to know. What's next for Hollow Creek?" Earl turned to her with mock suspicion. "You reporters never rest, do you?" "Rest is for people without deadlines," Nora replied with a playful smirk. Luke smiled at her. "She's writing another piece, isn't she?" "Of course," Nora said. "The people deserve an ending." "Then give them one worth reading," Earl said, half teasing, half serious. He turned toward the crowd gathering in the center of the yard. A small stage had been set up beside the barn. Simple, wooden, draped with the American flag and a banner that read, "1 year of second chances." Earl stepped up, the microphone squealing once before settling. The wind tugged at his coat, but he stood tall. His voice, though old and gravelly, carried with quiet strength. "Some of you knew this place when it was falling apart," he began. "Some of you helped me rebuild it, and some of you came here broken. Same as the dogs we take in." He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. Luke stood near the front row, Nora beside him, Rex sitting obediently at their feet. "I used to think I was beyond saving," Earl said, "that I'd wasted every good thing I ever had. But then, one dog, and one man, reminded me that nobody's truly useless so long as they still know how to love." He took a breath, his gaze flicking to Luke, then to Rex. "This place isn't about training dogs anymore. It's about healing. For them. For us. For anyone who forgot that love's the only command that ever sticks." The crowd broke into applause, some wiping their eyes. Nora's pen hovered above the page, but for a long moment she didn't write. She just watched. After the speech, as the sun began to rise higher, the group gathered for a photo. Earl stood in the center, Luke on one side, Nora on the other, and Rex in front, proud, alert, his ears tilted toward the wind. The camera clicked, capturing something more than faces. It caught forgiveness, found in the open air of a Colorado morning. Later, when most of the visitors had gone, Luke and Earl stayed behind by the fence, mugs of coffee in hand. "You ever think," Luke said, "that it all started with 6 minutes?" Earl smiled. 6 minutes and a stubborn dog. They both laughed quietly. Rex, sitting between them, tilted his head as if he understood every word. Nora stood a little distance away, finishing her final notes. The title came to her easily, 6 Minutes to Redemption. She wrote it at the top of the page, then paused before the last line. Her pen moved slowly, her handwriting neat and deliberate. It only took 6 minutes, one man, one dog, and one heart brave enough to trust again, to change the course of a lifetime. She closed the notebook, slipped it into her bag, and looked toward the field. Rex had broken into a joyful run, sprinting through the snow-dusted grass, leaving a trail of paw prints behind. Luke called after him, laughing, while Earl stood watching, his breath misting in the cold morning light. For a moment, it was as if the world itself was holding still. The wind soft, the light golden, and every wound that once ached now healed under the quiet rhythm of life. 2 men, 2 generations, bound not by duty or blood alone but by the grace of forgiveness, watching the creature that had saved them both disappear into the sunrise. Earl took off his hat and whispered, "Good boy, Rex." The dog's bark echoed across the valley, a single, perfect sound, and the sun broke through the clouds. Hollow Creek had found its second dawn. Sometimes God doesn't send us angels with wings. He sends us a broken dog, a weary man, or a moment that tests the depth of our compassion. Because miracles don't always come with thunder and light. Sometimes they happen quietly, in 6 minutes of courage, kindness, and love. Earl, Luke, and Rex remind us that redemption is never out of reach. No matter how far we fall, God can turn our pain into purpose, our loss into faith, and our broken hearts into instruments of healing. So if you're watching this, take a moment to believe. In second chances, in love that never quits, and in the small miracles that walk beside us every day. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe that God still works wonders through love, forgiveness, and faith. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us that light always finds a way through the darkness. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your life with the kind of miracle that changes everything, even in just 6 minutes.